There's a town in New England with a pond on the north end and a dusty old dead end where my Marie lives. And at night when the stars glow, I stand by the window and wonder what more could this life ever bring. There's a boat by the old dock, a slow-moving wall clock, and a front door left unlocked should neighbors drop by.
Hello, my name is Marty Civin, for those of you viewers that do not know me. 3 years ago, I started to write a story for my family. It's a story about my family, but more important for all you people in viewerland, it's a story about the town of Spencer in the 1930s, the 1940s, and on. I'm going to read the story. I'm sure there are parts of it that you'll enjoy hearing, and if anyone has any comments or wants to add anything to the story, when I'm through, I'll give you my email address, and please do send me an email because we'd like to improve the story too. So here we go. In order to give you a good idea of the story, I'm going to tell you first, or read to you from my memories, how my family arrived in Spencer back in 1932. The question has been asked, what brought the Civin family of the Seagate section of Brooklyn, New York to Spencer, Massachusetts on that Labor Day back in 1932? The answer is, times were hard. It was in the middle of the Great Depression. Changes had to be made by my mother and father. Of course, I cannot remember the events of the first few years of my life. This will be short of my autobiography. My family at the time of my father at the time of my birth was a partner with a man by the name of Mr. Cecil in a contract dress manufacturing firm in New York City. The way I understand it, a dress contractor would take the overload of work from larger and probably branded manufacturers. It was during the Depression, and I would guess there were not many overloads of work to be handled out to contracting firms. My father's company fell in hard times and consequently went into bankruptcy. A decision had to be made. My father would stay in New York and look for a job in his trade as a dress cutter, and my mother would take my brother Bob and me and her friend and boarder, Gertrude Farrington, to her mother's house, in Warren, Massachusetts. I don't imagine we were welcomed with open arms. My grandmother was not a particularly gracious person. Shortly after arriving in Warren, my mother opened the White Swan Tea Room in West Brookfield. The building still stands at the site of the tea room. Buscott Auto Parts now occupies it. My mother ran the tea room, and my uncles Max and Nathan sold Sinclair gas from a pump in front. The money for my mother's venture, I was told, came from $400 she had saved from table money from her home in Brooklyn. From what my mother used to tell, I guess the food was pretty good at the White Swan Tea Room. The only problem was there were no customers to try the food. My mother did have competition down the street from a restaurant known as George and Ethel. I was told they did all right because they sold bootleg hooch. We've got to remember this was during Prohibition. Prohibition had not been repealed yet. Of course, there was still no way my mother was going to sell booze. Mother closed the little restaurant, and Gertrude, who had been acting as my nanny, returned to New York. With the closing of the tea room in West Brookfield, I'm sure there was much to spare. What was to be done? We had to eat. And I'm sure my mother wanted to get out of the situation she was in, with all of us living with my grandmother. My mother and my Uncle Nathan decided to open a small clothing store. Nathan had recently graduated from Northeastern University in Worcester. He had a degree in business administration, but no job. Notice I said Northeastern University in Worcester. In those days, back in the early 30s, Northeastern was in the YMCA in Worcester. It moved to Boston years later. Now here's where we came to Spencer. On Labor Day 1932, the Civin family arrived in Spencer, and Civin Specialty Shop was born. It would be a name in women and children's clothing in Spencer for the next 30 years. My father had now joined the family in Spencer, but what I am told that for the first couple of months, he was not part of my mother and uncle's firm. He was looking for locations to open a grocery store in Worcester. Nothing became of my dad's grocery store plan, and he joined the business in January of 1933. You might ask, why Spencer for a location? Both Clevin Shoe and Allen Squire Company were working most of the time. And my Uncle Nathan thought that Spencer looked like a busy town. He used to come through Spencer on the trolley on his way from Warren to Northeastern University in Worcester. The first location of Civin Specialty Shop was at 47 Mechanic Street. From what my brother Bob tells me, it was pretty much of a dump. The store was heated by a potbelly stove that had to be used for both heat and to warm my mother's and my lunch. I will tell you more about that part of Mechanic Street and some of the people shortly. Remember, I was only 1.5 years old. Everything I am telling you about our arrival in Spencer comes from stories my parents told me and from my brother Bob, who was 7 years old. The total investment of the business was probably about $100 to purchase some used fixtures and pay a month's rent. To obtain merchandise, my uncle and mother bought on my grandfather's credit line. My grandfather lived in Brookfield and peddled clothing out of a panel truck to the area mill towns and farmers. I am going to describe what our surroundings on Lower Mechanic Street looked like back in the early 1930s. I classify Lower Mechanic Street as running from Cherry Street and Wall Street on the north to Chestnut Street as you headed south up the hill. On the east side, or left side of the street, on the corner of Cherry and Mechanic Street, stood the Lamro Furniture Store. Lamro Furniture Store at that time was considered the largest retail furniture dealer between Spencer and Springfield. I will tell you more about the Lamro family a little later on. The next store going up on the east side of the street was a saloon run by Tom Gaffney. Mr. Gaffney was a VFW buddy of my father. He had served in the U.S. Navy in the Spanish-American War. Mr. Gaffney's saloon, you will all probably remember as the All Sports Cafe. Next door, still going up the hill, was Young's Lunch. Mr. Young would be the grandfather of Janine Bankston. Next, going up Mechanic Street, housed a little store called Civin Specialty Shop. In the back of these stores was Burke's Court, a group of 3 tenement houses. A few of the families that lived in Burke's Court was a Mrs. Gregory. I will mention some of her descendants. The late Alan Gregory would be a grandson. Kenny Gregory, a great-grandson. Ruth Dufo, who was married to Charlie Dufo, would be her daughter. Also living in Berks Court was Yvonne Elder and Unibel and Pauline Arsenal. There was Walter Laro, sort of a hobo who used to walk around the street with a guitar slung to his back, and his mother Angelina, Mrs. Gagney, our landlady at 47 Mechanic Street, who had a terrible wine-stained birthmark on her face. She was the grandmother of the Mike Gagne, who was killed 30 years later in a shooting at the All Sports Cafe. Still going up the hill on the east side of the street next to our store was a vacant lot with a barn sitting in the back. The barn was the headquarters of the Livermore Moving and Trucking Company. Mr. Livermore was the grandfather of Gail Prouty, Dick's wife. I have been told that Mr. Livermore never bothered to register his trucks. After all, he used horses a few years before and he did not have to register them. Nobody bothered him about number plates. Still going up Mechanic Street towards Chestnut Street was a tenement house. I don't remember who lived on the upper floors, but in the little basement flat, an old man by the name of Frank Benway. I called him Uncle Frank. Frank Benway was perhaps 70 years old back in 1934 when I was 3, but he was my buddy. I remember him as a big muscular man with a mushy gray mustache who wore one of his shoes with a built-up platform, and to help him walk he used one crutch. I was told years later that as a young man, Frank Benway had been a lumberjack and had been injured in a logging accident. On the corner of Mechanic and Chestnut Street, east side, was Cecil Dalton's beauty salon. Cecil Dalton was the aunt of Roy Ledoux and the great aunt of Kevin and Kenny Ledoux. It was in her beauty parlor that my mother told me I had my first haircut. Let's cross the street and go down on the other side of the street. On the west side of Mechanic Street was a cottage occupied by retired police chief John Norton. Till the day he died, he never missed a parade. I have been told that he had an experience when he was chief of police that should go down in some type of history book. It was right after the present town hall had been built in 1927. Two strange men entered the police station that was situated in the basement of the town hall and stated they were state jail inspectors and they would like to see his new jail. Chief Norton was honored. No one had ever come to inspect his jail. He made the mistake of walking into one of the two cells in front of the stranger. One of the men shut the door in back of the chief and the door locked automatically. They proceeded to hold up and rob the post office and were never heard of again. As you went down Mechanic Street on the west side, you came upon a building with two stores in it. The first store was the barber shop of my father's buddy, Louis Laurent. My father, who was known to murder the English language, always called him Lawrence the Barber. Louis Laurent was the first French-Canadian to graduate from David Prouty High School. It was a two-chair barber shop. The other barber was a man by the name of Deschardins. His name is on the honor roll at the town hall. He was killed in action in 1944 in the invasion of the Philippines. In the store next to the barber shop was McCann's Ice Cream Shop. McCann's was owned by a Spanish-American war veteran by the name of Truffle Bossy and his son Ernest Bossy. Ernest Bossy considered himself quite a caballero with the ladies and was nicknamed Rudy Valley, a popular crooner of those days. If you bought a pint of ice cream at McCann's, used to cost 30 cents. It was packed in a square box. If you had just 15 cents, one of the bossies would take a butcher knife and cut the pint in half and sell you a half pint, with a wooden spoon, of course. Next came the tenement house that is still standing, and then the freight yard. One freight train a day used to come into the town at 10 a.m. If you wanted to take a passenger train, you had to go to South Spencer. That was the world on Lower Mechanic Street, south of Wall. Now, we mentioned the freight train that used to come in once a day. I have a little story I wrote about the Spencer freight train. I entitled it, The Iron Horse of Spencer. When I was a growing kid of 10 or 12 years old, growing up in Spencer, I used to have a thrill that I wish my children and grandchildren could have enjoyed. In the summer mornings at 9:45, I would leave my buddies who were horsing around on High Street and run down the hill onto Main Street. Past the Kenwood Diner I would run, and I would cross the street in front of the Massasoit Hotel. I would run down Wall Street, past the storefront place of worship of the Jehovah's Witnesses called Kingdom Hall. That would have been a storefront right underneath where Dick Adams now has his paper goods store. Past the Waldo Hotel, past Worthmore Foods. I would stop across the street from the Spencer Lumber Company, which is now the Wall Street branch of Flexcon. Here it comes, chugging down the track on the trunk line from South Spencer. The once-a-day freight train would steam into the depot on Wall Street every weekday morning at 10 o'clock sharp. It brought leather for the shoe industry, lumber for the Spencer Lumber Company, and grain for Worthmore Feeds and Dwight Proctor's Eastern States Feeds, and shingles for Frank McQuaid's roofing supply business. I thought that the steam engine was beautiful. I can remember it was coal black with a plaque affixed under the engineer's window stating the year that the engine was built. It was 1917, and it belonged to the Boston and Albany Railroad. After the engineer would drop his freight cars and switch tracks to pick up the empty cars, I would watch with excitement as the fireman would start to open the boiler door and shovel coal into the hopper, and the iron horse would start to back down the track to the main line in South Spencer. The biggest thrill would be when the engineer would blow the steam whistle and both the engine and the fireman would wave to me. Pleasant memories from so long ago. Towards the end of 1932, an operating plan was established to nurture Civin Specialty Shop into a reality. My mother would stay in the store, and my father would travel to some of the outlying towns and peddle clothes out of a car. About that time, my Uncle Nathan decided to leave the fledgling business and try his luck at finding a job in New York City. Uncle Nathan will appear a little later in this story. Let's get back to my father, the ex-dress manufacturer from New York, becoming a peddler. I don't think my father was too anxious to become a peddler, but my mother said that if my father would not go on the road, she would. With that threat, Dad was to become a peddler, but it was not to be that easy. My father neither knew how to drive nor did he own a car. My father purchased a 1926 Dodge Brothers touring car. Now let me tell you what a touring car was. A touring car had a roof, but where the windows would be was nothing but open sides. In the winter you attached curtains from the top of the doors to the roof. Now that the business had a car, my father had to learn to drive it. When my father came to Spencer, he found a man by the name of Mr. Cragen. My father had served in the 306th Infantry in France in World War I with Mr. Cragen. All I know other than that my father and Mr. Cragen were Army buddies, that he was a bachelor and he was a streetcar motorman, and that he drank too much. With Mr. Cragen's help, Grandpa learned to drive, and after 6 tries, my father was issued a license, and he started his road business. He sold clothes out of his car to Barry, Gilbertville, Palmer Villages, and Warren. He was a peddler for the rest of his working days. I think he enjoyed it very much. When we mentioned the getting of the license after 6 tries, on the 6th try, he did get his license. He was driving up Pleasant Street with a brand new license in his pocket, from what I am told, and he had an accident. He had had a license for maybe about an hour. But the sad part of it is, the person he had hit was the registry inspector that had given him the license. Those days, he didn't lose it. All the registry inspector said was, "Boy, I'm sorry I ever gave you a license." But as the years went on, he did improve somewhat in his driving. Not a heck of a lot, but he improved somewhat. I have been told that when Civin was first established that my mother used babysitters. I had a few sitters, but I'm told one of the best was a teenager by the name of Blanche Carbonell. Blanche later married Carl Berger, and for a number of years, a number of years later, they started Berger Oil Company. Carl has been deceased for about 20 years. But Blanche Berger is still alive in her 80s. I still buy fuel oil to heat our house from the Berger Company, though it belongs to E.T. Smith, a large Worcester oil dealer. Let's go up Cherry Street. In the early 1930s, I'm going to tell you where we lived and some of the people who lived in our neighborhood. We lived at 48 Cherry Street. The house still stands. It is the second house east of Ash Street on the south side of the street. The house belonged at the time to the Spencer Savings Bank. I would assume it most likely been part of a Depression-era foreclosure. I don't remember what the inside of the apartment looked like, but I do remember that there were 2 beautiful pines standing, one on each side of the front walk. I believe one of the pine trees became victims of the 1938 hurricane. But 70 years later, if you go up Cherry Street and look at 48 Cherry, one of the pine trees is still standing. We lived on the 1st floor. On the 2nd floor lived Frank Kimball and his wife Florence and 2 sons. Paul, about a year younger than my brother Bob, and Lawrence, a red-headed kid with a Dutch cut, was about a year younger than I was. Frank Kimball was employed as a farmhand in Sibley Farms. Sibley Farms was located where Ragsdale Chevrolet is today. Florence Kimball, I am told by Jane Gray, is still very much alive and in her 90s. On the 3rd floor, Mr. and Mrs. Buster Ashamble occupied the 3rd floor at 48 Cherry Street. Buster and his wife were childless, not childless, and he earned his living on a door-to-door residential bread route for the Wholesome Bread Company. The house below us on the corner of Ash Street belonged to Walter Prouty. Walter Prouty served as treasurer of the Spencer Savings Bank. On the second floor lived Mr. and Mrs. Tripp, the retired Spencer postmaster, and their daughter Eleanor. Eleanor, I remember as being in her 20s and always wearing riding apparel. The house on the other street of us belonged to Mrs. Mary Porter. Mrs. Porter was considered by many to be the richest person in town. Her husband had made a fortune in Oklahoma in the oil fields in the early part of the 20th century. She shared her home with her sister Emma Birch and her full-time maid Myrtle. Mrs. Porter, I was also told, was the biggest contributor to the Congregational Church in Spencer. Upon her death in the 1950s, it was said that she left over $1 million to the church. I don't know if it is true, but she was a very wealthy lady. As a 3-year-old kid, I used to visit her sister, Mrs. Birch, who was quite sickly. On her death, she willed me a picture of a Dutch boy that still hangs in Dorothy's in my bedroom. As a little kid, visiting my friend Mrs. Birch, I used to admire that picture. Mrs. Birch also willed my brother Bob the Bible that her father carried as a soldier in the Union Army in the Civil War. When we come back again for the next program, we will take up where I left off on the other side of Cherry Street and cover a little more of the town and talk about some of the people. I hope you enjoyed this program. And again, if anyone would like to comment on it, my email address is mcivin, M-C-I-V-I-N, all one word, @americaonline.com. Please, the only thing I would ask is please put memories in the subject line, just so I'll know what it's about. And if you disagree with anything or there's something you want to add, I'd like to hear from you. Be looking forward to giving you another story in a week or two. Thank you very much.
There's a town in New England with a pond on the north end and a dusty old dead end where my Marie lives. And at night when the stars glow, I stand by the window and wonder what more could this life ever bring. There's a boat by the old dock, a slow-moving wall clock, and a front door left unlocked should neighbors drop by. For a beer on the back porch, talk of the day's work, and a song from Marie at the blink of an eye. There's a waltz for the seasons, tunes for the times. They all seem to be passing by. When I hear Marie sing an old-fashioned love song, life becomes still like the moon on the hill, watching the troubled clouds fly. I've got a red Adirondack, a new garden out back, and an old army knapsack full of songs I call mine. But Marie, she's the singer, and when friends come over, harmonies lift through the oak and the pine.